Hey, welcome to AMA with LCJ. I am so glad to have you joining me today. It's Tuesday, 2 p.m. Central Standard Time, and I am so excited to have you all joining me again for another episode of AMA with LCJ. I must say, today's topic is going to be fun. We're going to be talking about elevating your team's inclusivity. Are you in? Now, when we talk about inclusivity, the first thing that people's minds go to is diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we're going to be talking about that. But I really want to challenge and open our mindset about how we think about inclusivity in the current landscape of being a leader in today's workforce, right? Hybrid, multi generational. So we're going to dive in. So thank you for joining me. We're going to have a good time. Now, if this is your first time watching me, I just want to let you know thank you. I appreciate it. And also, I have a neat little tool that allows me, if you have comments, if you have questions, I'll be able to see them and read them and answer them live. And I want to make this as interactive as possible. I do come in and I teach and I share thoughts and ideas around it, but the conversation's always so much more rich when you join me in this conversation as well. So let's hop in and get started. All right, so we're going to be talking about elevating your team's inclusivity. Are you in? Now, you're probably wondering, like, why would I even ask if you're in or not, right? That seems like it is or should be a given, if you will. Now, here's the thing. Not everybody instantly thinks about, from at least from a perspective. I'm not against diversity, equity, inclusion. I'm not against including people, but just a little bit about how we even talked last week, how perfection is pretty pervasive. I would say the same thing goes with unconscious bias or bias as we're leading people in the workforce. So when we're talking about inclusivity, I want you to stretch your mindset past race, ethnicity. Those are very real things, but be thinking about multi-generational, be thinking about experience, be thinking about technological savviness, all of those things across the board as we dive into the conversation of building an inclusive team. Now, I know you're probably wondering, like, why am I talking about this? Coming out of being a full-time DEI practitioner, I kind of had to think about, like, hey, what um what is it that I wanted to really kind of go after in terms of that? Hold on a second here. Sorry. Um, what is it that I wanted to really go after in terms of coming from being full time into this next iteration of my career? Well, uh, you know, diversity, equity, and inclusion is very important, and the work that those teams do are very, very important. But what I found a lot of times was, and I think I've said this on previous episodes, which is when it comes to DEI work, it is true and it is necessary. But I am also a firm believer that when you develop leaders to the highest extent, having we would be having less conversation about DEI in the manner in which we are having them now. And so I haven't really dedicated a full episode to really talking about inclusion specifically. And so I wanted to dedicate at least one episode, at least for this quarter, talking specifically about inclusion and what that looks like. And so let's just kind of dive in just so we can make sure that we all have the same. I would say we're all starting with the same level set, right? So when we talk about diversity, it includes race, ethnicity, it includes gender, marital status, any protected class you could possibly think of, generational as well. We go hybrid, you can go experience. Diversity is there are several and lots of different dimensions of diversity. And actually, you know what? Let me see if I can locate it. Because I think this is um the hold on. Sorry guys. So there was a specific graphic that I absolutely loved to use all the time. And let's see. Let's see if I can save this really quickly and pop it up for you. And the reason why I specifically loved this I love this graphic I love this graphic because in the process of really explaining what diversity is, we have to kind of get a broader understanding of why and how I talk about this. So there we go. Boom. I got it. Pulled it up. I just had this aha moment. For those of you all who are joining me, uh, you know how I get down. Like it's kind of inspirational, part preparation, part inspiration. Okay, so let's do this. So I want to share this specific window with you. Okay. So when we're talking about diversity, this is really what I want people to see and understand. As we're having conversations around inclusion, this is by far one of my most favorite examples to share. And the reason why I love to share this specific example is because typically we hop immediately probably into this internal one right here: race, age, national origin, ethnicity, physical or mental abilities, gender, sexual orientation. That is typically where we go when we talk about diversity. But what I love about this particular model of what it shows about diversity is that there are several dimensions of diversity. And so as you are thinking about building your team, when you're thinking about how you're leading across diversity to create an inclusive workforce, you got to move beyond, I would say, this little blue bubble right here, right? So you have somebody's personality, you have their internal, right? All the things that are internal to them, right? Like, and typically this is like some by design, by DNA, a lot of these things, right? Internal. Like, you can't change your national origin, your ethnicity, physical, mental abilities, like those things change over time, gender, right? How people identify, sexual orientation, race, age, all of these things, right? This is kind of what makes up the internal side, and this is typically what people go to. Now we talk about external. Now we're talking about geographic location, experiences, your family status, belief systems, your appearances, your interests, your education, your socioeconomic status. Then we're going to go organizational, which is one of my favorites. When we talk about organizational status, um, as a form of diversity, a lot of people are blind to this one. Um, and I'm going to use an example. Number one, you have seniority and tenure, right? That's a form of diversity. People act or respond certain ways, depending on what industry you are in, solely based on tenure, on your title, where are you located, what department you work from, what department you came from, right? Your management status, what function you're operating in. All of these things, all these contexts make a difference. And then encapsulating all of that is like era, right? And this is really where I think we're starting to see generational differences in how people work and how they show up, and how we're trying to figure out this new workforce that we have, with four, sometimes five generations across. Era becomes huge. Era becomes really huge. So you've got world events, political events, cultural events, and historical events. And one of the things I like to talk about when I'm talking specifically about era, as we talk about diversity, inclusion, equity, belonging for this particular episode, one of the things that we think about is we hit in the last, what, we'll say 4 years, right? So let's 2019, 2020, 2021, we hit all four of these simultaneously, especially if you're in the US, right? Not only did we have world events with COVID-19, but we had political events and political unrest. We had cultural events that were tied to political events, that were tied to world events. And then we had historical events all the way across the world, largely due to the world events, political events, cultural events, right? So everybody now has this part of, how they felt and what that looked like, even within this time frame. So as we're talking about diversity, I want to challenge you not to just look at the blue ring. As you're having conversations, as you're thinking about your team, as you're thinking about your colleagues, your peers, are you thinking about it beyond the blue bubble? Have you really took a step back and said, hey, do I have biases across orange, green? I believe that's like red. What are all these things? So this is kind of where we're going to start. And so I want to make sure we have a good basis for this. For those of you all who are listening, I hopefully that helped, because I kind of explained it out of the all the way through. All right, so I'm gonna stop sharing my screen and I'm gonna kind of pull my cheat sheet back up here. All right, so now that we have an understanding, we're gonna hop in and we're gonna ask some questions. If you have a question, please feel free to go ahead and drop it in the chat. I'll be able to see it. I've got all the things up, so I would love to engage with you, and answer any questions you have or highlight any comments. All right, so now that we have this kind of in order, one of the things that I want to first dive into really is what are some best practices? So that's the first question I have right now. So, what are some best practices for balancing inclusion efforts across different dimensions like race, age, location, work environment, everything that we just talked about? So, what are some best practices for these? So one of my favorite best practices in really bridging or balancing inclusion across dimensions of diversity is radical transparency. You'll hear me talk about that a lot. Radical transparency, as much authenticity as possible. Because this, when you kind of move towards this transparency piece of the puzzle, I think it allows for people to drop their armor, right? Like drop their shield, drop their mask, and really start to figure out, hey, like this is my preference for work. This is my preference. These are my experiences. Because in order for you to balance inclusion, you have to understand each person. And it's very funny. Like I hear a lot now about people saying it's very hard to be a leader now because historically, here's what happened. And there's a current event right now that's happening. That's a really good example of navigating very difficult waters. On top of what now is very public, a lot of times with things that were happening publicly in an organization, privately in an organization have now become public a lot more. So one of the things I often hear about is saying like, hey, it's so much work to balance, building an inclusive team, managing the work, trying to figure out, not wanting to offend people, everybody, trying to be PC, like all of these things. It's too hard to manage it all. And so one of the things that I have found is a great leader is already an inclusive leader. They don't necessarily have to learn that. I think historically, when we used to see leadership, it would be make a decision. That's a decision that they've made. However you felt about it, however, whatever you thought about it, didn't necessarily matter. Your job was just to execute, right? And so, what I think now, this shift, and I do believe that social media has played a lot into this. Is you have to balance these efforts. You have to figure out, hey, how do I get the best out of my team? How do I get the best? How are they working the best with each other? How do I get the outcomes that I want and desire as a leader? How does that mesh with the overall culture of the organization and still move things forward to be a great work environment? And it's difficult. I'm not going to shirk away and say it's not difficult. But here's what I'll tell you. I typically tell leaders, if you look at your paycheck, it's higher for a reason. You have to figure out how to skill yourself up in a way that allows you to be able to effectively communicate across all of these differences. So that's one of the best practices. I really do like radical transparency, but here's the other one that a lot of leaders miss with this. One of the easiest ways to start to balance across and be inclusive is making sure everybody has the same vision. Are we all marching and headed in the same direction? We understand our why and we're moving forward, right? So, why is this important in inclusion? Well, I can assume the best in others because I know what we're marching and moving towards. I can understand that, hey, like we'll all have our differences, but it's the thing that kind of pulls us together, right? If you, for those of you all who if you've seen Drumline, I'll use Drumline as the example, like one band, one sound, right? You got Nick Cannon, and he's this kid from another side of town, comes in, can't read sheet music, right? But is a phenomenon right on the drums, and he's crushing it and killing it. So he's trying to figure out how to operate within this band, within the culture of the band, even though he's a great talent. And so he had to learn a little bit how to assimilate to an extent, still maintain who he was and his genius, learning how to assimilate into the culture enough to where he's thriving and moving as a unit, but they all had the same goal in mind, right? At the end, they come together and the whole nine. But like that's really ultimately what you have to think about when you're trying to mesh or balance inclusion. Um, so though that's kind of one piece. The other one is communication. Oftentimes, one of the things I used to love was, I'd have one-on-ones with my team. And in those one-on-ones, it gives opportunity and lends space to have honest conversations. If I don't understand something or they don't understand something about me personally, about my decisions, and vice versa, it allows us the opportunity to answer or ask questions. I've always figured out a way to make sure that the work environment that I'm creating is safe. And so my question back to you is, as you are trying to figure out what these best practices are for balancing inclusion, regardless of like race, age, location, work environment, my question to you is, have you created enough psychological safety that if somebody experiences non-inclusive behavior, do they feel comfortable and confident enough to speak up? If they don't feel comfortable and confident enough to speak up, then that's where the problem comes, right? There's nothing worse than being on an outs on a team. If anybody who's listening or you're watching, right? If you've ever been on a team where you are, let's say in and out groups, right? You're on the outs, it is not a good feeling. And if you have people on your team who don't feel like they're included or they belong on the team, I can guarantee, I am willing to bet lots of money that they are likely not performing well either. And so you have to figure out how to balance, building in these team building moments, getting to learn to know each other. I talk about a lot in some of the previous lives that, I do these icebreakers, right? Depending on what I have to cover with the team, we typically would always do icebreakers before a team meeting, right? And usually they're, some days, depending on if we have a heavy agenda, I may say, okay, team, we're gonna do a 2-word check-in, right? And then I'll go around and everybody will do a 2-word check-in. And it allows me to kind of figure out what's going on in their world, right? If I'll say, hey, what's your favorite holiday? That allows me to understand more about their ethnicity, their race, their, right? Their location. Sometimes there are different things going on in the countries that they were living in and what they're excited about, right? If you had to eat one thing for the rest of your life, what would it be? Right. So while all of these kind of maybe feel silly, what it does is it allows me, one, to get gauge and people get a part of the conversation, right? But then on top of that, it allows me to kind of open up the world and open up those windows just to continue to build trust. As a leader, I must say this: you are always in the process of building trust, and you are always in the process of building psychological safety. In a perfect world, if you make a mixed step, for the most part, you hope that your team understands or your team member understands and you're able to move forward. But a lot of times, depending on what people's personal experience is with trust, you break trust, you've lost trust. And then it's a long process back. And so I typically try to start with an A and keep an A kind of in school when we're thinking about that. So those are some of the best practices I have when I think about really how to balance that inclusion effort. It really is, how we're conducting meetings, how I'm spreading the work, where people are in their process, location. Another good example of balancing inclusion is time. What time are your meetings? Here's the thing. I typically, a lot of my team was in the States. I had some team members who were in other parts of, like, it was in Latam and, a couple that were in Europe. But I tried to think about, even if you have a team that's only in the States, let's just keep it, we're gonna keep it really simple. If you have a team that's only in the States, if you know that a majority of your team has kids, let's just say you manage a team of 6 and a majority of your team has kids, would you schedule an 8 o'clock meeting? I don't. I typically don't schedule 8 o'clock meetings because kids, here in Texas, there's a it's a rollout for school, right? So probably most people from about 7 to about 8:30, people are dropping their kids off. They're getting their kids ready for school and they're dropping their kids off. And so I typically try not to schedule meetings during that time because I don't want anybody on my team having to choose between their family and work. Because when they're at work, I want them focused on work. When they're with their family, I want them focused on their family. Right? Like there's, and look, I've had kids, I've had my kiddo on a call, on a work call, but I try to be as intentional as possible about balance. That's a good example of being inclusive. What are the best times? Are you trying to do meetings, in the morning when people are trying to get their kids out of school? I guarantee you they're not retaining anything anyways. If you've ever had to wrangle an elementary or primary aged kid or toddler to school, I guarantee you they're not hearing half the stuff you're saying. Promise that, right? So if you know, let me know. If you're in the chat and you know this to be true, definitely let me know because I know you know. Um, okay. So that's another good example. All right. So now we're gonna move on to another question. You all are quiet in the chat today. Last week y'all were chatty Cathy's. Man, that was not inclusive. I just caught myself with that one. It's so funny. Um, you guys were very chatty in the uh in the chat last week. So make sure that if you have questions, comments, drop them in. I want to hear from you for today's show on building inclusion. Now, let's cover our next question. Um, mm, I am actually going to, since we actually talked about this, I think this is a good segue question, and then we'll move on to some other questions that I think are really good. But in my experience, what are effective ways to measure the level of inclusion and belonging within your team? I think this is a good segue question, largely because of what we just talked about. Um, what are some good ways to measure that? So, in order to measure um, inclusion and belonging within your team, you say, okay, Toya, great. You said to do all these things, but how do I know that I'm doing them? How do I know that I'm doing that? Um, I would say there's a couple things. Number one, I always go back to asking. Ask, ask. Um, a lot of companies nowadays do some level of um inclusion training, right? So, not training. Well, they do inclusion training, but they do engagement surveys, right? So, the company sends it out and says, "Hey, do I feel included? Do I feel like I belong?" etc. Right? So that's one way that a lot of companies do that. They submit engagement surveys. Um, my favorite way is not relying on an engagement survey, and I'll tell you why. Typically, engagement surveys come out once a year. You may be a part of a company that does a little bit more regular syncs. I know some companies that go down to monthly or weekly check-ins, just yes, are you doing good? Yes or no. But for the most part, I've seen typically companies do them 1 to 2 times a year. And then they'll do some other like quarterly check-ins here and there. So let's just say for the sake of this conversation, your team does it twice a year. So the reason why I say I don't think it's a good idea to rely solely on that as a measurement of inclusion and belonging is because you'll only know how well you're doing 6 months from now. And I like to try to figure out how you can do these check-ins regularly. If you are having regular one-on-ones, which I hope that you are with your team members, these are questions you should be asking consistently. Hey, how are things going? Right? In a one-on-one. How's work going? How are things going with the team? How are things going with stakeholders? What does that look like? How are you doing? And, at first, it may be hard for somebody to give an honest answer. And I think over time you start to build the trust and I'm like, yo, actually, I'm not doing good. Right now, I'm frustrated. I'm feeling like this, and this is happening. Right. I remember I had a team member, um, struggling with a stakeholder. And she's like, "Yo, I'm gonna be honest, like this is giving me straight PTSD vibes, like, right? Like, I've been in situations where I'm the only black woman in this scenario, right? And I'm the only black woman in this scenario, and now I'm the only black woman in this scenario, and I've had experiences where this is not good, and this is causing me harm. Like this is stressing me out. Thank you for sharing that." And so now I can figure out, okay, let's look at what this is. Let's look at what it's not. Let's figure out how we can reshape your work. Do we need to reshape your work? Do we need to reassign your work? Do we need to do I need to have conversations with stakeholders? Let's really open this up. And so it's important that you ask your team members how they're doing. If you don't ask them how they're doing, then that's probably a good starting point to measuring how well they feel included and belong. If you have new team members, at that 30, 60, 90-day mark, when you hire somebody in and it's their first 90 days, at the 30-day mark, at the 60-day mark, at the 90-day mark, I would expect that you're asking, hey, how are things going with the work? Do you have everything you need? How do you feel you're meshing with the team? Right? Do you feel like you belong? Do you feel like you have a voice? Do you have a seat at the table? Because here's the thing. Sometimes people think seat at the table means that I have to listen, not listen, that I have to do everything that's said. Sometimes seat at the table means I have an opportunity to share my concerns and voice my concerns. There's not always this expectation that people are, just because you're at the table, that everything you put at the table is going to be accepted. I don't think many people hold that expectation. I think it's a assumption that a lot of people make. But, that would be kind of one of the ways that I would really think about and go about understanding and measuring inclusion and belonging with your team. You can rely on those engagement surveys or manager surveys that your organization has. But I would encourage you to be more proactive by asking in one-on-ones. I would find ways to do that in team meetings and asking if people feel like they're included or they belong, doing check-ins, asking people how they're doing. How's the work? Do they feel like they're integrating? Do they have everything that they need within the team? I can't stress enough how many leaders I know who do not ask this. If you are a leader and you work for a leader, I want you to think about, when was the last time your leader asked you, did you feel included in everything that's happening? Do you feel like you belong? Just think about it. It's not a common question. It's just an assumption that, here's what I'll say about this. This is the funny thing about inclusion and belonging. A lot of leaders believe that just because they communicate something, that is inclusion. Just because you communicate it doesn't mean that I feel included. Oh, well, I told you about this. I told you such and such, me and Bob had a conversation and I told you we had the conversation. So now I've notified you that the conversation was had and this is what was decided. That doesn't necessarily make you feel included. Now, what may make you feel included is like, hey, I was in a meeting with Bob. Me and Bob, we were talking about this one thing. This is one of the things that we're talking about. I would love to hear what your thoughts are about this. Do you have any insights? Is there anything else that you wanted to add to this conversation? That is inclusion. That is belonging. Informing is not including, right? Okay. Hope that makes sense. Like I said, you all are quiet today on the chat. It's all good. I understand. You know, it works out. All right. So now that we are moving on to the next question. So here's the thing. This next topic, I will tell you, is near and dear to my heart. So the next topic that we're going to be talking about, as far as like elevating your team's inclusivity, we're going to be talking about multi-generational workforce. Because here's what I'll say. Trying to think about how I want to how I want to articulate this next statement I'm going to say. Okay. The next statement that I'm going to say, really around managing multi-generational workforce, is, I would say, probably going to ruffle some feathers, but I'm okay with that. I'm okay being slightly contrarian in this scenario. I think a lot of sometimes things that are potentially perceived as race or ethnic issues are more generational than they are race or ethnic. I'm not saying that race and ethnic like bias, right, do not occur. They absolutely occur. The data shows that it occurs. If you look at any Fortune 500, you look at their executive board, you look across like their board, their executive leadership team, their senior management, everything points to the fact that there is absolutely bias in the in there is bias in existence in organizations, right? So I'm not saying that race and gender bias do not exist. I am saying that I also believe that generational diversity is playing more of a role than people give credit for. And let me explain. So one of the things, you know, one of the funny thing about it is, sometimes I'll hear it's like, oh well, we don't want to generalize all we don't want to generalize everybody into one category, right? Like we don't want to stereotype. I agree. We don't want to stereotype people. I wholeheartedly agree with that, right? I don't disagree with that in any shape, form, or fashion. But here's where and I believe I closed out I closed out my own window while I'm pulling this up. Um so one of the things that sorry y'all, I'm a horrible multitasker for the record. I just want to put that out there. Um so when you think about all the things that are generationally, every generation in the modern workforce today has different things that have shaped who they are, period. And this is why I think it is something that is not talked about enough. Um, I think people are talking about it more, but I also think that it's kind of pushed under the table because I do think that some things that occur within race and gender are also the undercurrent exists within it generationally as well, right? So if you look at, and I'll give you an example. If you look at who's still in leadership in the current workforce right now, senior leadership in most organizations is still ran by boomers. The primary workforce during this era of boomers was what? In the US and broad were men and or white men, right? That's who's in leadership. Typically, you duplicate themselves. And so then you go into Generation X, so you have more women entering the workforce, and now you have more people of color who are, BIPOC, black, indigenous, people of color, right? All of these communities trying to figure out how to get into the workforce and then move up the workforce. Now you have you have millennials, right? Gen Y, and then you have Gen Z, right? And Gen Y, Gen Z, millennials, Gen Z are now moving towards to being the most diverse populations around, right? And so it takes time to catch up. And so when we think about, let's go back to that diversity, when we go back to that diversity wheel that we just talked about, right? All of these things shape how they view work. And so when we're thinking about in what ways, right? I didn't even put the question up. I'm going to add it up there. In what ways have I observed different generations impacting team dynamics and decision making processes? I do believe that some of these things do fall generationally. If you think about boomers, like and how they did business, it was who you knew. It was 100% about who you knew. I'm not saying that that's not the case, but I am saying it is a lot more. Hey, like it's the shaking of the hand. It's I know this person's a good person, and I know these people because a lot of work, right? They started work before internet became a thing. And so it relied heavily on your personal network and who you knew, right? Hey, Bob will say, "Hey, actually, I need somebody." Bob's gonna say, "Hey, actually, I know Mary. I know Mary's husband. We know each other really great, face to face." That's how they did business. And so then, and all of this is still sitting, keep in mind, at the top. They haven't left yet. They're still in the workforce, right? And then you have Gen X, right? And so then Gen X kind of comes in, and sorry, y'all, gotta sneeze. Hopefully I'll get it. Um, Gen X comes in, right? And so now you've got the entering of you got the early stages of like the personal, the PC, emails coming into play. A lot more of this workforce is coming in, right? They're figuring it out, right? And then you've got millennials now, and millennials, we've had the internet. We're natives, digitally native people, right? And so now we're moving through the workforce. And then now we have Gen Z creeping in. They're a few years in. And so what we see, right? And I'll give you a really good example of how the generations impact team dynamics and decision making. There's a really cool graphic, but I'll give you an example, right? So maturists, right? Maturists, they're the silent generation, is what they call them, are before boomers. Anybody who's born before 45, if you're still in the workforce, God bless you, right? It's a very small percentage who's in the US workforce. But I'll give you a great example. That particular workforce, how did they communicate? Paper. Boomers, telephone. Gen Xers, oh, email and then eventually text message. Millennials, text, social media, right? Gen Z, text, social media, all the things, right? So, you go from these errors of even how we communicate is different. I guarantee you, I hope my friend, she's watching. I love you, Jess. I'll just give her a hard time. But it's so funny. Like we're two different generations, right? I'm a millennial. She's a Gen Xer. And so we laugh, right? Because she'll be like, "Oh, I gotta handle this thing." Her first thing is to call. I'll be like, "You gonna call him on the phone? You gonna talk to people?" My first inclination is, do they have a chat? And do they possibly have an email? I'm probably not talking on the phone. So now you take that same dynamic and you enter it into the workforce. Now what does that look like? Right? What does that look like? We have very different communication styles. So we've got to find a balance between the two. My leader, when I was in corporate, knew I did not like email. I preferred message. I can go in, I can read them, I can parse through them. If I need to pick up a phone, I'll pick up the phone. I didn't really care for email because email for me was kind of like a waste of time. I didn't want to do it, right? Or meetings. And so all of these things are starting to come through. Now, what becomes even harder now, the other phenomenon that I think is happening in the workforce and in the workplace in general is this: more options, right? So it's really cool because it's kind of this. There's a graphic and it talks about, hey, what was important for these workforces as they were going up, right? If you go back to the era, we'll say silent generation, right? Silent gen was home ownership. Boomers is job security, which actually doesn't surprise me because they're still working. They have not left, right? They haven't left, okay? This is crazy. They're still here, right? Gen X, right? Gen Xers, it was work life balance. They're digital immigrants, but work life balance, right? So they were the early beginners of what we like building these portfolios of careers, right? Then you've got millennials. What do we value? Flexibility and freedom. If I don't feel like I have any flexibility or freedom, it's a quick way to be like, ugh, ugh, it's not for me. I can speak at least for myself in that, right? I want flexibility. I want freedom. We've seen this post COVID, right? Most companies, if you do not have a hybrid option, some people are saying no. And they're not saying no to the work. They're not saying no to not being to being in the office. They're saying no to being in the office all the time. Right? Valuing freedom and flexibility. Now, here's what's funny. I'm sorry, you all. I'm dealing with some allergies, and so I feel like every 3 seconds I'm gonna sneeze, but it doesn't come. Okay. Now here's what's funny. Now we move into Gen Z. And what does Gen Z want? They want security and stability. And so one of the quick ways to security and stability is I think a lot of Gen Zs are now more into I am going to create my own wealth. I'm not going to wait, which is why I think, you see people like it, even generationally, right? They are not typically going to be a group, and you're seeing this even in millennials who are going to stay in a job for 30 years. You're just not. You're not going to see people staying in companies 20 and 30 years, right? They'll work with it, but they're not going to work for an organization, right? They're going to be, Gen Zs. You'll see them typically they're working corporate and they're also working a side hustle. And and here's the thing. Now, I'm going to challenge you. If you're watching this and you maybe fall into the boomer or X and you're saying, "Yeah, and I think that that's crazy that they're doing this." Millennials, and just think about what millennials and Gen Zs have lived through up until this point. I'm 40, right? 9/11, Columbine, right? War, COVID, right? Y2K, right? Not one, but now two recessions. And I'm not saying you all haven't, but if you think about during very pivotal times and very pivotal parts of the year, right? This is what we're seeing. You're seeing this like in pivotal parts of my adulthood where shifts and changes. So naturally, freedom and flexibility is going to be important. Building or having something outside of, hey, I'm going to go and work for this company and hope that this company does what they need to do is moving away from that. And so when we think about building a team that's inclusive, as leaders, you've got to figure out how to do better. We've got to figure out how to manage across all of these things. I might have even said this last week, but like right now, there are some Gen Zers who have never stepped foot in an office yet and have been in the workforce 2 and 3 years. Don't know what an office environment is. And so how do you build culture? How do you help grow and understand culture? How do you build it? How do you manage careers and talent? Right? There's an entire era of leaders who've never led in person, only hybrid. How do you build relationships? What does that look like? How do I build a team? Right? Because if I'm a leader and I became a leader when everybody was still in the office, and so I've built a rapport because I've managed this team for the last 2 years in person pre-COVID. And now I'm trying to explain to a first time leader who now has a hybrid team that is decentralized from us how what the advice that I give may not even be relevant anymore. And so as we're thinking about how we're building inclusion in a workforce today, you've got to take all these things into account and be like, okay, Toya, I don't have time. I don't have time for all. This sounds exhausting. But I will go back to telling you the number one hack. It's not even a hack, y'all. The number one way that you can build inclusion in your team is getting to know your team. Know your team, know their styles, know their preferences, know their aspirations. Right? Like that's like one of them. Oh, they just want to move up the corporate ladder. Like, oh, they want everything now. Sometimes, you know, one of the things that I remember having this conversation with some senior leaders. Um, Jessica says, so exhausting. I see that. Yes, it is a lot. But I won't say but, and it can be a lot. If you don't have a plan, what is your plan to success to figure out how to build these inclusive teams? You have to build the system. If you build the system, it won't be stressful. Yeah, I'll give you guys a great example. So I remember talking with a group of senior leaders. So I go in the room, talk to a group of senior leaders, and I come in, and here I am, an executive in diversity and inclusion. So they, naturally think, okay, Toya is going to come in and talk about diversity and inclusion and why we should be diverse and inclusive and all these things. I'm like, yeah, you're right. Yeah, I'm going to come in. And I was like, hey, what questions do you have? And so I remember one of the funniest things was one of the leaders. He's like, well, my problem is they just want to move the needle now. They want to get promoted so fast. I was like, do they? Or do they want to know the path forward? And I think that that's a very different question. right? Because he's like, I never thought about it that way. It's like, yeah, sometimes it's not. I'm trying to do the next thing now. But for so long, and if you've been in the workforce, and I'm gonna drop this out here, especially if you are a woman or person of color, sometimes figuring out how to get to the next step was very elusive. And it just felt like this like secret handshake club that you couldn't figure out how to crack the code, right? And so now you have especially millennials and Gen Zs who have the world literally at their fingertips most of their life. And you're saying, hey, just keep working at it and you'll get there. That's not what is step one and what is it that I need to do? And this is how leaders are going to have to evolve as we're looking at different workforce, right? It's leading with transparency. It's having conversations. It's knowing your team. It feels exhausting, Jess. I hear you. It can be a lot. But the more that you get to know your team, the easier that it becomes. And this is what I keep drilling down. I probably say this almost every live. Know your team. If you know your team, you'll be able to crush it, right? And so as we're thinking about, what are some of the unique challenges and opportunities, this is really where I want to end. I want to end on a high note because I feel like we've drilled down kind of serious there for a second. So when we're thinking about the question, like how can leaders effectively address the unique challenges and opportunities that come with managing a multi-generational, and I will also add multicultural team, right? I'm going to add that in there, right? So generational multicultural team. What are some unique challenges and what are some unique opportunities? I think we've covered the challenges. The challenges is you don't know what you don't know. That's probably the biggest challenge of it all. You don't know what you don't know. And it feels very hard at times to figure out, not wanting to misstep, not wanting to offend, trying to figure it out and manage the work. That's the challenge, right? That's the challenge of all of this. As far as, am I building inclusion? Does everybody feel like they belong? I want my team to feel like a team, and I also want my team not just to be so like kumbaya that they're goofing off and not getting work done. I've got to find this balance, right? That's kind of the challenge. I think that's the unique challenge of managing multi-generational, multicultural teams, is getting to know everybody and kind of understanding how to capitalize on that, how to figure out to really move the team forward in that way. Now, let's talk about the opportunities, because I think there are more opportunities than there are challenges once you create the system to be successful in this. Okay. So, what are the opportunities for this? Innovation, problem solving. One of the things that I love is when I'm coaching leaders, when I was in corporate, outside of corporate, coaching leaders on how you build your team, what does your team look like? I always say, does your team look the same? Do they all sound the same? Because if it is, that's not good, right? You want to build your team from people who have different experiences, different ways about going about solving things. Maybe somebody who would not necessarily fully fit the mold of what you're looking for, right? Not when I say not fit the mold, I say maybe not a non-traditional route, right? Everything about my career was non-traditional. Everything about my career was non-traditional, and yet I proved to be successful. And that's because I've worked for leaders who understood that I had a lot of um tangible, intangible skills, or I guess transferable. That's what I'm looking for. I had a lot of transferable skills that would make me successful just about in every role that I could. If I wanted to go for it, I could figure it out. I'm a problem solver. I'm a strategist. I love to tinker, right? I'm a technologist at heart. So I'm always thinking about technology and how to incorporate it, right? I'm I'm legitimately a fast learner. Like, I know some people say that in an interview, I'm a fast learner. Like, bro, it took you 6 months to figure this out. Like, I am legitimately a fast learner. That is one of my superpowers, right? Especially I can get locked in on something. And so it allowed me to be successful. And so as you're building your team and managing your team, you should be looking for opportunities to diversify your team, right? If you have everybody who's always been at this space and place and doing it, you don't know that there's a better way. How do you know that the way that you're doing it is the only way? And if you're doing this, this is where you're missing out on opportunity. If you have a team, like I'll tell you, like sometimes one of my biggest challenges, one of my favorite things to do, I'm gonna be honest, in challenging, you know, in challenging and when I was in an organization was challenging people who've only worked in one place. If you've only worked in one place, I'm going to challenge you because your entire view or understanding is solely based on one place. If all you've done is work in, I'm just going to toss it out there. If all you've done is worked at company X in HR, you've only worked in one department of one organization, that's problematic. Because I would challenge you, how are you expanding the world and your worldviews and what you're doing? And if I have, I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm saying if I'm building a team and I start to see that my team kind of looks, sounds, and moves alike, I'm going to start to say, okay, when I have an opening, I'm going to expand it just a little bit more. I want somebody who maybe isn't drinking the Kool-Aid or hasn't drank the Kool-Aid, right? And so let's talk about some other advantages on why the opportunities are really high when you manage a multi-generational, multicultural team, right? When we look at diversity in general, right? And I cannot stress this enough before I even talk about the advantages. When we talk about inclusion, I am not talking about assimilation. Assimilation is when I come into the team and you are willing to accept my differentness internally or externally if I choose to assimilate or act or kind of become a part of that. That's assimilation. I am not talking about differentiation, which is I appreciate who you are and the differentness that you bring to the table only when it suits me and benefits me. True inclusion means that not only do I know, understand, and recognize your difference, but I understand the value that it brings to my team and to this work. Therefore, I'm going to include you. That is inclusion. So when we're talking about diversity and inclusion, I need like this is where we are. Okay. So when we talk about, let's talk about some data. Let's just crack open the data of what the advantages are or opportunities there are when you're leading a multi-generational, multicultural team. Okay. So let's break down some good old stats. All right. So number one, McKinsey report. I'll give you a great example. McKinsey report says that um, companies in the top quartile, in the very top quartile of for ethnic diversity are 35% more likely to have financial returns above their respective national industry medians. So if you have a multicultural team, specifically ethnic diversity, you are 35% 35% more likely to have financial returns, right? Research from Clover Pop indicates that diverse teams make better business decisions up to 87% of the time compared to individuals. And they make these decisions faster and with more confidence. Why is that? Because you're solving it from all these different angles. I'll give you a great example. How many times have you been on the outside looking in and you see a company, you'd be like, yo, that was a horrible decision. Did they have nobody that looked like that? I've seen a few. I've seen a couple commercials, right? Dove had a sketchy commercial once, right? Like it was pretty bad, right? I think Ralph Lauren had an issue. At one point they had a pair of pants with Greek letter paraphernalia on their clothing. Nobody was in the room. But you can make those decisions faster and with more confidence when you do have different points of view, because different points of view kind of allow people to point to, like, hey, we've actually expended all the opportunities. A report by a Boston consulting group found that companies with more diverse management teams have 19% higher revenues due to innovation. Why? Why is that? Because differentness helps. You want somebody to come in and not necessarily think it's the shiniest thing ever. You want someone to be like, that window's cracked. Did you know that? and not feel any type of way about it, because that's how you get better. You get better by getting different perspectives, different points of view in the work that you're doing. You want a Gen Zer on your team. You want somebody who actually is really understanding and utilizing AI so that you can figure out how to move into this next industrial revolution that is absolutely going to include and is including AI and machine learning. Period. Point blank. If you don't know it, you're trying to understand it. You better find somebody who can, or at least has a working understanding of it. Forbes research shows that 85% of CEOs whose organizations have a diversity and inclusiveness strategy say it has enhanced their performance. You know why? Because not all the best talent is found in the same pond. Eventually that pond goes to zero. One of my favorite sayings, when I was leading the work in D&I was, diversity and inclusion is not about replacing one with the other. It's about building a bigger table and casting a wider net. I want the best and the brightest, period. And that's how you have to think about it as a leader. I want the best and the brightest, period. And if you build your team with that in mind, that's really how you're going to start to see a lot of the gains that you're seeing here, right? Another one, McKinsey, companies in the top quartile for gender diversity on executive teams were 25% more likely to have above average profitability than companies in the fourth quartile. These are the opportunities we're talking about, right? When you have a diverse and inclusive workforce can help with turnover, attrition. Attrition costs money, lots and lots of money. I'm actually working on it right now. A calculation. Can you actually calculate attrition? What does that look like? What that formula is? That's like one of my little pet projects, right? A diverse workforce can help really ensure compliance with various laws and regulations related to employment and workplace practices, also reducing risk. Those are opportunities. So I just want to implore you, like, move beyond what you think diversity and inclusion is and really stretch yourself into figuring out. But the number one way that you can do this, right? Stop looking only at that one little bubble that is internal, but look at external organizational error, all these things that make up people, their diversity dimensions. Get to know your team, know their strengths, know what their expectations are, what their experience are, like all of these things, and watch everything roll. But you don't have to figure it all out tomorrow. You piece by piece, one on one by one on one. That's how you're going to do it. All right. So thank you so much. This is all I have for you today, but thank you so much for joining me. I hope that you enjoy today's episode. I'm excited next week, as I'm literally feeling myself about to sneeze. Next week, we will, hold on here. Oh my goodness. Okay, there we go. I knew it was coming. I was waiting this whole episode to sneeze, and it finally, uh, next week, we're going to talk about the art of delegation. So we're going to talk a little bit more about delegations. I think we talked a little bit about it last year. We're going to dive a little bit more into delegation and what that looks like next week, and really how effective delegation helps you really be more productive. So with that being said, before I sneeze again, thank you all so much for watching and for listening to AMA with LCJ, and I will see you next week, Tuesday at 2 p.m. Central Standard Time. Have a great week.